Hello guys, welcome back. This is the Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks by Skloot, and you know it, this is chapter 22, the fame she so richly deserves. So let's just dive. One afternoon in the late spring of 1970, George Guy stood in his favorite waders on the bank of the Potomac River, where he and several other Hopkins researchers had been fishing together every Wednesday for years. Suddenly, Guy was so exhausted he could hardly hold his fishing rod. His buddies dragged him up to the embankment to the white jeep he'd bought using money from a cancer research award. Soon after that fishing trip, at the age of 71, Guy learned he had the disease he had spent his entire life trying to fight. And he had one of the most deadliest forms. Oh. Pancreatic cancer. If doctors didn't operate, Guy would die within months. If they did, it might buy him a little time, or it might not. On August 8th of 1970, around 6 a.m., Margaret called each member of the Guy's lab staff, including a postdoctoral student who had just flown into the Red Eye. Oh, from Europe. "Come down to the lab as fast as you can," she told them. "There is going to be an emergency procedure this morning." She didn't tell them what procedure would be. Before going down into the operating room, George told his surgeons that he wanted them to take samples of his tumor, just as Dr. Wharton had done with Henrietta's tumor decades earlier. Guy gave his lab staff careful instructions for growing Gigi, a line of cancer cells taken from his pancreas. He hoped that his cells, like Henrietta's, would become immortal. "Work all day and night if you have to," he told his postdocs and assistants. "Make this happen." Soon, with Guy anesthetized on the operating table, surgeons opened him and found that the cancer was inoperable. Growths covered his stomach, spleen, liver, and intestines. They worried that cutting into the cancer might kill him. Despite Guy's wishes, they sewed him up without taking any samples. When he awoke from anesthesia, he found out that there would be no Gigi line. He was furious. If this cancer was going to kill him, he wanted to help advance science in the process. As soon as he recovered enough from his surgery to travel, Guy began contacting cancer researchers around the country, asking who was doing research on pancreatic cancer and needed a patient to experiment on. He was flooded with replies, some from scientists he didn't know, others from friends and colleagues. In 3 months, between his surgery and his death, Guy went to the Mayo Clinic in Minneapolis for a week of treatments with an experimental Japanese drug that made him violently ill. His son, George Jr., who had just finished medical school, sat with Guy through the whole thing and made sure he had a freshly pressed suit each day. After leaving the Mayo Clinic, Guy spent several days in New York City at Sloan Kettering for another study, and he underwent chemotherapy at Hopkins using a drug not yet approved for use in humans. Guy was 6.5 feet tall and about 216 pounds when he was diagnosed, but he withered quickly. He often doubled over from abdominal pain. He vomited constantly, and the treatment soon left him confined to a wheelchair. But he continued showing up at the lab and writing letters to his colleagues. At some point not long before his death, he told his former assistant, Mary Kubitschek, that it was fine to release Henrietta's name if anyone asked, since it had been so many years. But Mary never told us so. George Guy died on November 8th of 1970. A few months after Guy's death, Howard Jones and several Hopkins colleagues, including Victor McCusick, a leading geneticist, decided to write an article about the history of HeLa cell line as a tribute to Guy's research career. Before writing the article, Jones pulled Henrietta's medical records to remind himself of the details of her case. When he saw the photographs of her biopsy, he immediately realized the tumor had been misdiagnosed. To be sure, he dug out the original biopsy sample which had been stored on the shelf since 1951. In December 1971, when Jones and his colleagues published their tribute to Guy in the journal Obstetrics and Gynecology, they reported that the original pathologist had misinterpreted and mislabeled Henrietta's cancer. Her tumor was invasive, but not epidermoid carcinoma as originally diagnosed. Rather, the article said it was a very aggressive adenocarcinoma of the cervix, meaning it originated from glandular tissue in her cervix instead of epithelial tissue. As misdiagnosis of this type was not uncommon at the time. In 1951, the same year Jones biopsied Henrietta's tumor, researchers from Columbia University reported that two types of cancer were easily and often confused. According to Howard Jones and other gynecologic oncologists I talked with, the correct diagnosis wouldn't have changed the way Henrietta's cancer was treated. By 1951, at least 12 studies had found that cervical adenocarcinomas and epidermoid carcinomas responded the same to radiation, which was the treatment of choice for both types. Though it wouldn't have changed Henrietta's treatment, this new diagnosis could help explain why the cancer spread throughout her body so much faster than the doctors expected. Cervical adenocarcinomas are often more aggressive than epidermoid. Her syphilis, it turns out, could have been a factor as well. Syphilis can suppress the immune system and allow cancer to spread faster than normal. Regardless, Jones and his colleagues wrote the new diagnosis was but a footnote to the abiding genius of George Guy. It has been often said that the scientific discovery results when the right man is in the right place at the right time. Guy, they said, was precisely that man, and Gila was result of that luck. If allowed to grow uninhibited under optimal cultural conditions, Gila would have taken over the world by this time, they wrote. The biopsy has secured for the patient Henrietta Lacks as Gila an immortality which has now reached 20 years. Will she live forever if nurtured by the hands of future workers? Even now, Henrietta Lacks, first as Henrietta and then as Gila, has a combined age of 51 years. This was the first time Henrietta's real name appeared in print. Along with it, for the first time, ran the now ubiquitous photograph of Henrietta standing with her hands on her hips. The caption called her Henrietta Lacks, Gila. With that publication, Henrietta's doctor and his colleagues forever linked Henrietta, Lawrence, Sonny, Deborah, Zachariah, their children, and all future generations of Lackses to the Gila cells and the DNA inside them. And Henrietta's identity would soon spread from lab to lab as quickly as her cells. Just 3 weeks after Henrietta's name was first published, Richard Nixon signed the National Cancer Act into law and launched the War on Cancer, designating $1.5 billion for cancer research over the next 3 years, in a move many believe was intended to distract attention from the Vietnam War. Nixon announced that scientists would cure cancer within 5 years, just in time for the United States bicentennial. With this new funding, came intense political pressure for scientists to meet the president's deadline. Researchers raced to find what they believed to be the elusive cancer virus, with hopes of developing the vaccine to prevent it. In May of 1972, Nixon pledged that American and Russian scientists would work together in a biomedical exchange program to find the virus. Though much of the war on cancer hinged on research using cell cultures, few people knew that those cultures had been contaminated with Gila. A Washington Post reporter had been at the conference where Gardner announced the contamination problem, but he hadn't covered it. And most scientists were still denying the problem existed. Some were even conducting studies aimed at disproving Gardner's findings. But the problem wasn't going to go away. Near the end of 1972, when Russian scientists claimed they found a cancer virus in cells from Russian cancer patients, The US government had samples of the cells hand-delivered to the Naval Biomedical Research Laboratory in California for testing. It turned out those cells weren't from Russia cancer patients at all. They were from Henrietta Lacks. The man who discovered that fact was Walter Nelson Rees, a chromosome expert who was director of cell culture at the Naval Laboratory. Nelson Rees had been in the audience when Garler presented his infamous research, and he was one of the few scientists who believed it. Nelson Rees has since been hired by the National Cancer Institute to help stop the contamination problem. He would become known as the vigilante who published the HeLa hit lists in Science, listing any contaminated lines he found, along with the names of researchers who would have given him the cells. He didn't warn researchers when he found that their cells had been contaminated with HeLa. He just published their names, the equivalent of having the scarlet H pasted on your lab door. Despite of all the evidence, most researchers still refused to believe there was a problem, and the media didn't seem to notice until news hit that the Russian cells had been contaminated by the American ones. Only then did the newspapers in London, Arizona, New York, and Washington run headlines saying things like "cancer cells from long-dead women invade other cultures." They reported serious confusion, misguided research, and millions of wasted dollars. Suddenly, for the first time since the Collier's articles in the 50s, the press was very interested in the woman behind those cells. They wrote about her unusual kind of immortality in one article after another. They called her Helen Larson or Helen Lane, but never Henrietta Lacks, because Jones and McCusick had published her name in a small science journal few people read. Rumors spread about the identity of this mysterious Helen L. Some said she had been Guy's secretary, or maybe his mistress. Others said she was a prostitute off the streets near Hopkins, or a figment of Guy's imagination, a fictitious character he had created to hide the true identity of the woman behind the cells. As Helen showed up in the articles again and again with different last names, a few scientists began feeling the need to set the record straight. On March 9th of 1973, the journal Nature published a letter from J. Douglas, a biologist of Brunel University. It is 21 years since George Guy established the famous HeLa cells in culture. It has been estimated that the weight of these cells in the world today exceeds that of the American Negro, from whose cervical tumor they originated. That lady has achieved true immortality, both in the test tube and in the hearts and minds of scientists the world over, since the value of HeLa cells in research, diagnosis, etc. is inestimable. Yet, we do not know her name. It has been widely stated that he and La are the first letters of her names, but whereas one textbook says the names were Helen Lane, another says Henrietta Lacks. My letters to the authors inquiring the source of their information, like the letter to the hospital from which Guy's paper emanated, remained unanswered. Does anyone know for sure? Would it be contrary to medical ethics in the HeLa cell's coming of age to authenticate the name of and let HeLa enjoy the fame she so richly deserves? Douglas was flooded with responses. There is no record of readers addressing his question about medical ethics, but they did correct his grammar and used the word of Negro in place of negress. Many replies offered the names of women they believed were behind the HeLa cells: Helga Larsen, Heather Langtree, even the actress Hedy Lamarr. In a follow-up letter on April 20th of 1973, Douglas announced that all those women should withdraw as gracefully as they can, because he had received a letter from Howard W. Jones that left no doubt that HeLa cells were named after Henrietta Lacks. And Jones wasn't the only one setting the record straight about Henrietta's name. Soon, Victor McCusick, one of Jones' co-authors, would send a similar letter to a reporter from Science, correcting her misuse of the name Helen Lane. In response, the journalist wrote a short follow-up article in Science titled HeLa for Henrietta Lacks. In it, she explained that she inadvertently repeated the lore about the origin of those cells, Then, in one of the most widely read science journals in the world, she corrected her error. Helen Lane, it seems, never lived, but Henrietta Lacks did, long protected by the pseudonym Helen Lane. She also reported that Henrietta's tumor had been incorrectly diagnosed. None of this alters the validity of the work done with HeLa cells, she wrote, but it may be worth nothing for the record. This is the end of chapter 22 and also the end of part 2 of the book.